notice that, as mentioned, these petechiae, they are more commonly found in strangulation because blood will get there, but the oxygen will not. So it can burst these blood vessels and you'll see them. But in hanging, blood doesn't get there, so it doesn't cause the petechiae. So that's another way of having the oxygen lack. Not through hanging, where the blood doesn't get where it should go, but by strangulation, where the oxygen simply doesn't get to the lungs because the person's trachea was closed off. There is yet a third way, not by closing off the trachea, but this is called smothering. That's where the mouth and nose get covered. So oxygen doesn't get there because it doesn't even get into the mouth and nose, which is where the air gets from the atmosphere to the trachea on there for the lungs. So that's a case of smothering, often done with a pillow or a gag material. It might even be sort of an accident. If a person is captured and is gagged, the person might choke on the gag and they'll die through this smothering. So usually, or almost always, this is when a person dies of asphyxiation, someone had to hold that pillow over his face. Except it could happen like an infant, like I don't know, something might fall on top of them and they can't push it off because they're too weak, so they die through asphyxiation. Or even an accident, like a building collapses and the person has something all over his face and he can't move. But usually, if you see death through asphyxiation, then you immediately start assuming anyway, it's a homicide. Incidentally, with gag material, it might be inhaled. If so, then look for that gag material. It might be indicative of who strangled him, or more information as to the perpetrator of the crime. Okay, that's as far as oxygen lack. There's also gunshot wounds. It's one of the most popular ways. It's the most popular way of killing people in this country. Not in India, for example. There they kill mostly with poison. Things change, though. This is like a very cultural thing. But anyway, the popular gunshot wound death. The one thing we really want to know is how far away was the gun muzzle, because it's very often it's one of the most popular ways of committing suicide. So the perpetrator will very likely try to make it look like a suicide. So we have to know how far away the gun muzzle was. If it was 10 feet away, it's extremely unlikely it was a suicide. So we got to find out how far away was that gun. We look for powder distribution around the wound, because gunshots, you produce a little bit of haze of gunpowder. So we see if it was right around there, well, it was probably really close. In order to find out how close, we compare it to the gunshots, the same weapon elsewhere. Like we shoot off the other weapon and see, okay, how does the gunpowder go? And this depends on the bullet, depends on the weapon. But we try to compare it. We find the gun or the kind of gun. We see whether there could have been powder distribution, at which distance we'll know whether he could have killed himself or how far away this was. We also want to know the wound track. We mentioned this a little bit before. How did the bullet get through the body? Let's say it goes up from the bottom of the stomach all the way up through the heart and out through, let's say, the right shoulder. Well, it's really unlikely this was a suicide. Probably someone shoved the gun up from below and whatever, and that's why the bullet traveled that way. So we want to know the wound track. So another thing, it's important to find out. Well, again, this is probably the most important idea. Was it self-inflicted? Did the person kill himself, or was it for someone else? It's a very big difference between a homicide and a suicide. Another thing to recognize is sometimes even the bullet might not kill by itself. In other words, the bullet didn't destroy the brain or the heart or some important organ, and that killed the body. It could be the bullet might have caused an infection or maybe loss of blood, and that's what killed. So we want to know about that too. Okay, now we have drugs and poisons. It's not as popular as gunshot would, but it is nevertheless popular enough. These things, people think it's like you can't see the marks, so you can't be traced. That's not true. We have abilities to trace death through drugs and poisons. The idea of drugs is, again, drugs are all over the place in today's society, unfortunately. So we always test for drugs. And by the way, we're getting better and better at checking and testing for even really, really tiny amounts of drugs in a body. And they're getting easier and cheaper and faster. So just the point is we have these tests. So don't think you can get away with it necessarily. Poisons, we only test if there's some indication. Dart wounds, burn marks, smell of almonds or burnt almonds, that's cyanide. It's a popular poison, and you can tell whether the person was poisoned with that by an outward sign. And we only test, though, when we have these outward signs, because usually we don't. In this country, it's not that popular way of killing people, so we usually don't test for that, unless we have witnesses saying something or there's some other evidence that the person might have been poisoned. And again, we're getting very good for testing for those drugs, those poisons. We've dealt with a bunch of different kinds of causes of death, meaning what was the medical reason or the actions that caused the medical condition of death. But now we're not talking about the cause or the physical act that made the death, like gunshot wound, asphyxiation. We are talking about the manner of death, and there's a good mnemonic you could have for the five manners of death. There are only five. The person who puts the report down, like the one who does the autopsy or the one who the coroner or whoever examines the body and claims yes it's death. They have to say one of these five manners of death. And the Sean is suicide, homicide, accident, undetermined, and natural causes. So we're not going to be doing it in this order, but that's a way to remember all the different kinds. Okay, let's look at homicide. Possibly the most violent one of them. So this is defined as being the intentional or negligent action of another. Like, in a car accident, it might be completely negligent of the driver who crashes into somebody else and causes the death. So that is, or it could be intentional, which is obvious. This is something that's debated in courts because the one who's going to be guilty is certainly going to try to say it wasn't homicide. And even though this is debated in courts and then they decide that it was not proven to be homicide, the original report that said homicide doesn't have to be changed after that. And in the case of homicide, we want to know when the person died. What was the time of death? How long occurred between the examination and the time of death? For this we use, we're going to get into this a little bit more soon. Algor mortis, that's how the temperature change of the dead body. Livor mortis, that is the color of the body due to blood pooling in the body after death. And rigor mortis, that's how the muscles tighten after death. And they do it with certain time frames, so we can figure out a little bit about when the person died. Okay, the second one is suicide. This is, I guess, obvious to many of you. It's the intentional taking of one's own life, killing oneself, obviously. This is, again, debated in courts because was it suicide or was it homicide? A lot of times, people who kill others, they try to make it look like